I was asked by a coworker to look at their pole saw, and it turns out the engine was stuck, and the most likely reason was that it was in a flood. Now, after doing quite a bit of work, we were able to free the engine, but the issue was that I ended up making a serious mistake, and that's where we left the project up until now. I think I found a way to fix my mistake, but I don't think a lot of people watching are going to agree with the way I'm going to do it, and maybe even say I'm making a mistake. In today's video, we're going to be looking at this pole saw, and the problem was initially that it wouldn't start because the engine was stuck, but in the last video, I sheared the key that's machined into the flywheel, which of course means it's still not going to start and run. The reason might have changed, but the bigger picture is still pretty much the same. Now, I'm going to try and repair this pole saw, but yours might be a little different, so this might not work on yours. If things aren't working out for you, like in the video, please ask about it, and I'll be glad to answer your questions. So if you missed all the surprises from the first video on this pole saw, here's where we left off. Now, after freeing the engine, I installed the flywheel and recoil assembly, but I forgot to install the clutch, which holds the flywheel to the shaft. I then went through the steps for a test run, but during the test run, the flywheel was able to shear the key, and now I made my job a whole lot harder. Now here's a clip of that disastrous moment. Yes, that definitely was not my finest moment during a repair, and the worst part is I'm sure it's not going to be my last. Now, after releasing that last video, I was flooded with comments on how I should fix it, and to be honest, all of them were great ideas, but I decided a repair I think works well for this situation, and here's what I did. So what I did was to use my smallest round file to cut a groove into the flywheel where the key should have been. That way I can add my own key. Now I thought long and hard about this choice, and I think it will work the best for the situation I'm in, and I'm going to explain why I chose it. And not only that, but I'm also going to tell you what the other choices were and why I did not choose them, at least for this occasion. So the reason I chose the method I did was because, to be honest, it really was the easiest way with the best chances of lasting a long time. Now, there were certainly a few different things I could have done to make it even better, which was to have the correct key size on hand instead of having to cut one down to size. The other improvement would have been to use a small needle file with a flat edge versus using a round one, which is the only one I had at the time. Now, one of the other choices that would have been 20 times easier would have just been to line the flywheel back up and, using a lot of thread locker, tighten down the clutch and call it good. Now, there are a few concerns about using this method, and the first one was making sure the flywheel would stay lined up while I tightened down the clutch. The other reason was that since this was a pole saw and not just a trimmer, a sudden stop on the saw portion could cause the flywheel to shift on the crankshaft since there was no key. The other option was to drill and tap the flywheel for a tiny bolt that would act as a key. The only problem is that if the bolt should break again, it would be even harder to fix the second time. However, if it did happen again, I would probably just drill out the bolt and install a roll pin instead. Either way, it would require a lot more work to fix. To be honest, I probably should have just bought a new flywheel, so why didn't I? And the reason is cost. The $20 for a new flywheel, even though it's quite affordable, pales in comparison to the fix I just used, which required no money and no extra time. And the fix is what I would call reasonable as well. Now, I know some of you might not agree with my choice, but then again, I cannot make everyone happy with my choices. Now, I've almost got the machine back together, but before we try and start it, I've got to try and lubricate the throttle cable. In the last video, for some reason, the throttle was sticking and it wasn't working the throttle plate on the carb. Now, the plate wasn't stuck, so I'm guessing the cable was the issue. Now, you can use whatever you have on hand, but I'm just going to spray some lube into the cable and work it a little bit to try to get it all the way to the other end. The other option would have been to take the cable off, put it into a sealable bag, and then fill the bag with lube. The only problem was that once I was done, I had to try and put the cable back into its anchor, but I soon realized that it was almost impossible to do while the carb was mounted to the engine. So unfortunately, I had to take it off, but I was going to have to do it at some point. I just didn't think it would be right now. Now, it would have been a good time to take the carb apart and inspect it, but you never know. The carb might be in working condition, so I'm going to give it a chance. Now, I do plan on doing a test start with the way the lines are right now currently. The only line that's broken is the return line, which is not a big deal. It just means the fuel won't be going back into the tank. So I have to resist the urge to spill a lot of fuel out of the carb while purging the air. The last thing to do is to put some fuel into the tank, press the bulb several times until fuel starts to come out of the carb, and then we'll be ready to start it. Well, that was kind of unexpected. The good part though was that it started, but the bad part was that the idle speed was set way too high. I'll turn the idle screw out a few turns and then we'll try that again. So it didn't start this time, but to keep the engine from flooding, I'm going to turn the choke off and try that again. Now at this point, I really wasn't even expecting the engine to start and run, so we might need to take the carb apart and service it. So I'm going to give it one more chance, but this time I'm going to help it out by putting some fuel into the carb's throat. If it starts and runs, the fuel flowing through the carb might be able to flush out any old varnish in the passages. If so, we may not have to service it. Otherwise, if it doesn't, then we'll have to make a choice on what to do next. Luckily, the engine started and ran, but the problem is that I don't like the way this engine sounds. It just sounds like a bunch of marbles rolling around in there. I have to wonder if one of the bearings took a hit while it was underwater. So it seems this engine is starting and running to some degree with a little bit of help. However, I know this thing was in a flood for an unknown amount of time, so I think it would be best if I take the carb apart and inspect it and service it before I give it back. So you might be thinking that I'm being a bit too cautious, and for the most part I would agree with you, but knowing the condition of this pole saw when we first got it, I think it would be a wise choice. Although if we're talking about good choices, I probably would have just ordered a new carb last week, knowing what we know about it now. That way we don't even have to mess with this carb. The reason for being cautious though is because we haven't examined the rest of the fuel system, like the fuel lines, fuel filter, and purge bulb. I will say this though, we are very close to getting this machine up and running again, and the fact that we were able to free the engine and restore the engine compression I think is pretty amazing, considering it looked pretty bleak at the beginning of this project. So in the end, we fixed the key and got the engine starting and running again, and to be honest, not for a lot of money, which is something I don't like putting into this grade of equipment, but typically no matter how much something costs, I'll try and give it as much time as I can afford, just not the parts. So my question is, what do you think of the fix for this broken key? Do you think I made a mistake, and would you have done anything differently? Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.